Welcome to Wellness Radio with Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher as your host. Her show discusses topics of health, wellness, and spirituality, and is about discovering your place in this great universe, from your cells to the cosmos. Along with her guest, in casual conversation, she strives to ask the difficult questions that may be holding you back from a vibrant life, and shares new ideas that may inspire you to make a change in your life that you only can see in your dreams. And now, here is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wellness Radio. This is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher, and it's a pleasure to have you with us here this evening. Tonight we are going to be talking about differences, similarities. Are we all the same? Are we all different? What is this world about? Let's talk about the paradigm between left and right, between right and wrong, between perfect, imperfect, good or bad. What is it all about? About life and death, being here in entirety, having a human or a spiritual existence. All of these things are judgments through our perspective. Today we're going to be talking about how can we see what our perspective is telling us. Today my guest is Judith-Kate Friedman. She is a steward of the Mythsinger Legacy Project and representing Deardorff's book, The Other Within, The Genius of Deformity in Myth, Culture, and Psyche by Daniel Deardorff. Thank you so much, Judith, for joining us today. It's such a pleasure to have you with us.
Thank you so much. I'm very glad to be here, and I'm sure that Daniel is also glad that our conversation is happening.
I'm so glad to have you to talk about this topic, because just as you pick up the book, you say, The Other Within, The Genius of Deformity. You know, I think sometimes if we have lived long enough, as I have, you know, I myself am almost 70, I look at it and say, there's been so much over the decades of trying to attain perfection. And when you attain it, you're on like this pedestal, and yet everything else is not in your world or of your existence. Do you think perhaps that society has projected a definition onto that word over the years?
Onto the word deformity?
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. The word deformity actually was something that we even discussed with the publisher as far as whether they wanted to continue to have that subtitle in the third edition. And ultimately, everyone agreed that the power of what Daniel Deardorff is intending is to give us many different ways of seeing deformity through the book. So it's absolutely essential that it's in the title. And in the very beginning, his philosophy is built upon, well, his book, writing a book about the genius of deformity, for him was coming from a combination of all of his studies in myth and then his intensity of his lived experience as a person who was paraplegic due to paralytic polio, which he had from 17 months onward. And so as far as being a particular person where his circumstance was nobody could look at him without seeing that his body was twisted, that he had different deformities or disfigurement or different ways that those words might be used, differences, and different ways of moving around than the person who's standing up on two legs. That's just one whole area or arena of form and deformity. He was very taken by, I guess, the French philosopher Gaston Bachelard, who talked about liberating the imagination, and I think really liberating the soul. And that he talked about taking form of any kind, like you can even consider like breaking bread. You have the form of the bread, like a baguette, and then you break it. You now have the possibility of sharing it. you now have a completely other thing that is breaking open. That's like a very pedestrian example maybe, but it's tangible. We can taste it. It's like all of a sudden we can smell it and taste it differently because it just broke open. So this idea of deforming allows us to have new liberating experiences.
I think also, too, it's truly about removing the human vehicle that we stepped in, as I call it, our wetsuit, and operating from a different source, which is the source of our soul spirit essence. We're truly coming from that other place. And when we do that, all of these other stories and senses and things we're trying to accomplish or fix or correct or whatever don't even show up anymore because they aren't even part of something necessary to fuel the soul and the spirit. The soul and the spirit has something so much different to be fueled by. But when you let go of the human stuff, you realize, man, when we stepped in to be human, we just collected a whole bunch of what I call it as space junk that kind of got magnetized to us. Do you know what I mean? Yeah, and it's like all of this stuff. And I mean, even if you look at humans in the past several decades, in the 30s and 40s, they were killing each other with the wars. 50s and 60s, they were killing each other in their homes, domestic abuse. 70s and 80s, they started to, it was drugs and sex and alcohol. Then you look in the 90s and the 2000s, it was all about perfection. We all want to look perfect. We want to have houses. We want to have cars. Then all of a sudden came along the years, in the 2020s. Things shifted. Things changed. We realized that wasn't really where we were going. Do you think perhaps Daniel's book is truly an evolution in which he had already stepped into that paradigm, had explored all of the other myths and all of the other stories and shamanism and everything to be able to step into it and say, perhaps it's a piece of this and maybe a piece of that, maybe a piece of that, so that we wouldn't be fearful where we are today?
That's a beautiful question. The book is very much a gift for the healing of both the individual and the culture, and therefore the wholeness, the entirety of culture and nature, which in our environmental crisis right now, whether we're conscious of it or not, is also impending on us. I think our nervous system is very awake to what's happening with extinction of species, for instance, as well as violence in the world, as well as threats to all kinds of, things being torn apart, be it our hearts or our families or our communities or our politics or our this or our that. And there's many, many layers in this particular book that draw on the wisdom of I think there's 99, so I always say almost 100, of wisdom teachers, poets, some of them going back hundreds of years like William Blake, Lao Tse, the Greek myths, and then also from various cultures, all different kinds of cultural myths and stories that as many traditions know or believe, understand, come from the earth itself. So there's a lot of different kinds of wisdom that Daniel started ingesting in his own experience that helped him make sense of not only the medical situations that were initiatory for him, but then also the medical surgeries necessary and unnecessary that he lived through that were a whole journey until the age of, 14. He spent most of his first 12 years of that in the hospital. And so he had come through all of these things, and the myths ended up giving him a language to begin to talk about this, which ended up in the book, as well as his oral storytelling. Then he became a musician. And so he had an entire decades of work as a rock and roll musician fronting stadium shows and being a person that didn't walk. and that was very unusual. So he was able at that time to break barriers for people with disabilities being seen and heard and appreciated, until the music industry didn't know what to do with that because the prejudice was so strong. He was basically exiled from that, even though his successes were true. And so then he became a producer of others, but then his polio came back as post-polio. And there's quite a number of people in your generation is the last wave. And hopefully we will have eradicated polio, even though it's now been found in the water supply recently in New York. So it's like, please let that not come back. And, you know, there's a movement to eradicate polio in places around the world where it still exists, because it can be so absolutely debilitating. And for people who didn't expect to live as long as they got to live due to the good graces of life force and Western medicine, or Eastern, or combination of all medicines that they found that kept them going, post-polio then comes back and it starts to take away the second growth of the nerves that had been able to grow forward and help people retain their muscle use. And so that's what was happening with Daniel, even from his 40s. He lived to be in his later 60s, and he just passed in 2019. But in that third period of his life, he picked up a book that was talking about shamanism. And it talked about how the shamans had the bones of their bodies taken, disassembled and rearranged and so on. And in these descriptions of the otherworldly descriptions, he found his own story. Like, this resonance spoke to his soul. He's like, that's what happened to me in the hospital when I was young. And so all of these overlays of civilization, healing through medicine, technology, and so on, the careers that we can have, the various things that do try to aim towards perfection. And then there's the soul, and there's the wild, and there's the unkept, and there's the part of us that we really know is true and alive and curious and often gets tamped down. And for him, as a lifelong artist, singer, person with a poetic spirit, ever-curious learner, he was making a synthesis of all of these things. And I think we each do that in our own way. But for him, he gave us an image I want to give to the listeners here that has been very helpful to me personally since I ever heard him teach about this, which is the mandorla. You can imagine he would teach this with two hula hoops. So you could take one circle, imagine that as the oral tradition, the wild, the part of the world that was walled off from civilization. And then you have the other circle, the civic, the part of culture that is then imposed upon people, and there are laws, and there are dogma, and there are various mores socially that we're supposed to adhere to, and so on. If you overlap those two circles, you end up with the vesica piscis, or the almond-shaped, eye-shaped space. That is the both and the neither this nor that. And that's the space that I hear you speaking from. I know that I, said a lot just there, but that's the place that I really hear you speaking from. You're standing here, we're talking through technology to people, and yet we're talking of things that are not tangible. They're not all of this world.
What I had written on the front of the book when I picked it up, I always do this. I set my hand to the book and I write something down. I wrote, "The other is the core spirit of the eons of our soul journey, the path of enlightenment." And I think that's truly what we're talking about. The other within. What he's sharing is many fragments of his path of enlightenment through his many soul journeys, perhaps. Yes, and can you say that again, what you wrote down? Because that's such a beautiful encapsulation. It says, the other is the core spirit of the eons of our soul journey, the path of enlightenment. You know, I've said it on this show before that our soul has a trajectory. And I think of it as a ball of glitter in the galaxy. And it's on a trajectory, and it intersects perpendicular with another trajectory. And that's our ancestral lineage. That's our, you know, what we're born into. So when these two intersect, you then have the human story. And I think of myself as an avatar. When that happens, I'm downloading all of the information that came from that ancestral lineage into my mind. I have fragments of where my soul lineage was before, and I keep little pieces of it, but I'm now downloading the human one. And we tend to operate only from that human one instead of finding all of the fragments and constructing a life going forward from that. And I think that's what his book, The Other Within, is truly trying to do, is to find all of his soul fragments, validate their existence with all of the different types of knowings that he could connect with through history, through time, through lineage, through philosophy, through spirituality and everything. And when he connects all those pieces, he's piecing together what I had just said, his path of enlightenment, perhaps?
Yes, I think that he is, and I think that you are upholding something that, in a certain way, I have not yet heard anyone else articulate it as you just had, and I'm really moved by this as almost a portal into the book, what you were saying. And what's really interesting in the book is that all those stories, there's about 37 or more of myths that he touches on. He's very interested in associative mythology, which is a term that he coined because he didn't like comparative. He wasn't interested at all in hierarchy, but rather in us all being in a circle together and hearing each other equally and letting all of the stories talk to each other, because he understood the stories to be living as well. There's a soul that the stories are carrying to us. So we have an interactive relationship with the stories as well, these old stories that have lasted millennia. And he chose stories that spoke to him, and many of those stories are about otherness in different ways. So there are these layers and layers and echoes of examples of exactly what you're talking about. You know, how do we navigate through the different initiatory journeys of our lives? How do we have a sense of being able to hold paradox between the wild and the unseen and the spiritual and the things that are coming from our not knowing, and at the same time going to a job and raising a family and having tangible objects in our house that we move around and clean and take care of, whatever, that we're grounded humans and we're also something else. And so he's giving us not only his own perspective and his lived experience, but very much millennia of examples of this, so that he always said that the stories that we hear, like around the fire, you can imagine sitting like a hunter-gatherer band in times of yore, whatever part of the world we were in, listening to wisdom being handed down through narratives, through these oral tradition stories. And they come into us viscerally in ways that instructions that are told, like you should, blah, 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 from parents or teachers or authorities, those instructions will never stick in the same way as a lesson that's coming up from the earth that makes us just go, aha, some truth has just been told. That's why he said that a myth is a story that tells a sacred truth without the use of facts. Yeah, go ahead.
Judith, as you're speaking, it's like I just, as I'm a medium also, I also saw it as what Daniel was doing was truly being his soul journey within all of his soul existences was perhaps to be the seeker, to be the guide, to be the seeder, perhaps to be the one that would be of showing and guiding the masses at that time. So in essence, as he's going through each of these stories, he's finding and seeking out, about what's really going on in those stories, when in essence, what he's doing is he's recanting his past life. He's recanting the connections he's had in the past. He's doing it from a point of awareness that he's already had. And in essence, when we do that, like when I walk down, I live in New Orleans, when I walk down the street, I can hear the clip-clop behind me of the horse, and I'm a little black boy running into the store, into the lapidary that's on the corner. And it just plays out like a movie screen to me. When in essence, if he's picking up all these fragments of all of these myths and all these stories and these things are seriously talking to him and connecting to him, and he feels them so deeply within as if it is playing out in this moment in time, those are in essence all of his past soul journeys. Perhaps maybe he just didn't come to that awareness, or perhaps he's hoping that by him writing this book, we would come to that awareness and we would also open up further.
Yes, that's exactly where I was heading in my thinking. It's not only his soul journey, it's our soul journey as members of the human species. The storytelling and the story carrying, the transmissions through these old stories, right, and the images in them are about what human beings are made of. It's how human beings communicated for millennia before there was a printing press, before there was the internet, before there was television and radio and phones, before there was right, whatever is going to be invented next. And so eventually, I think what's going to be invented next is we'll get back to some kind of ability to listen and telepathically communicate with all beings.
Yeah. I say that on the radio all the time. Good grief, I wish you people would get over this human stuff. It's like I cannot wait for telepathy. Yep.
But,
it's
so
wonderful.
I just want to really underscore that it's not only individual, and that's why the title...
Yes.
The Genius of Deformity, when he would give a talk, the first thing he would say, as people looked at him as a man with a spirit that was huge, a voice that could fill stadiums like honey, and then a body that was small and twisted in a power wheelchair on a stage, and that contrast. And everyone might project a million different things from their own experience onto him until they hear what he's about, right? And so he would say, as a kind of disclaimer from the get-go to set things straight, I am not the genius of deformity. And in fact, and it was like a joke, but it was like, in case anyone wondered. So the genius is not anybody. It's something that we each have. And this is an old idea that the genius is something that comes into us and that we not are possessed by so much as collaborate with and can cultivate, just like you can cultivate creativity with connecting with the muses. You can, in whatever kind of spiritual relationship or creative, imaginal relationship one has with one's muse. This idea that there's an I and a not I, the one that walks with us that we cannot see, to use words from a poem by Jimenez, which is quoted a few times in the book, that there's this awareness to walk through life with, that it's not only us. It is us, but it is us individually, but it is also us collectively, and then it is also us in the current time, the past time, the future time, because this book is not about linear time. It comments on linear time, but it's very grounded in the vertical, the connection between the understory, the underworld, the earth, the below the earth, and the sky, the overworld, the heavens, the beyond. And here we are as humans in the middle.
Yeah.
And this is the reason why Daniel loved the image to teach with the image of the Norse tree. The world tree from Norse mythology is called Yggdrasil, And there's the great below with a serpent. There's the great above with an eagle, a thunderbird, or a condor in different traditions. And right up and down the center of that great world tree, there's a squirrel that is a mammal that scampers up and down, and it brings messages from the above to the below and back again. Their messages in the case of the Norse is insults. They're hurling insults through the squirrels. So it's very funny. They're teaching each other by kind of, however you would have the art of commentary in a form of insults. But the squirrel named Ratatosker, which means drill tooth, is a great character for us as humans to think about our mammalian selves that are caught in the in-between of everything. And how do we connect the above and below? And what do we hear from both of those realms?
I had shared about the soul being a ball of glitter. And when we hit in that trajectory and become human, it's like we've descended into this, I call it a wetsuit, a human wetsuit. That's our human vehicle. And on the outside of the wetsuit are all of these badges, so to speak, and they're all about our identity, who we are, what we are, our experiences, all of these other things. And truly, when you talk in the book, when Daniel did about the city and the forest, I wrote on the top, human versus soul. And it says about two opposing or contrary forces. And I would truly see it as the human wetsuit versus the ball of glitter. That's what it is. Because in essence, the soul needs the human wetsuit to be able to exist in this world at this time. Human wetsuit cannot exist without the soul because that's its force. But what we're trying to do is we're trying to say, can we blast off all of the stories in which we judge, our perceptions, our filters, the screening of our senses, the mechanisms of our brain, all of the blah-da-da-da-da, so to speak, and truly come to being the human wetsuit, devoid of everything else, and just in that intimate interaction of the soul that enters the human wetsuit, and there's nothingness. There's just that purity. There's just that unconditional moment, and nothing else is there. Truly, I think that those of us like you and I and Daniel and many millions of others are truly seeking that because we know it. We've been there before, and we're trying to let others know that that's what the word hope is all about. That's what the word, as he shared, is genius all about. That's what the word we call soul essence, or we call it divine guidance, or whatever we want to call it. But we all know of that. It's just we're in the process of shedding all of this stuff that the humans have really, like I said before, space junk. We've got to let go of this space junk. Do you think that perhaps...
Yeah.
Go ahead. I think that perhaps, when we think about that, we go, but where's the space junk going to go? And we're going, I don't know, but maybe we can exit this existence and then it'll go somewhere else, right?
Yeah, I wish he was here to comment. I'm trying to think, because I think the space junk, I could feel his head shaking up and down,
Yeah. Yeah.
I'd like to read something from the book so we could get his voice in here if I could, just to
sure.
So he's talking about, there's a chapter here called Gnomonica. So gnomon is the sundial, the old-fashioned sundial. And I don't know about this word mnemonica, whether it came from him or somewhere else, but that's the title of this chapter. And it's subtitled The Tree of Joyful Difficulty. So again, here we have the mandorla, the overlap of the neither this nor that, which is also the both and, the nothingness, the emptiness that you're mentioning. That is also the everythingness, like that it is like the stuff of what we are made of. That idea that chaos, which we think of as a negative thing in Western culture, is connected with chaosmos, the fertile realness of what happened in the Big Bang of everything being able to come into being. So he writes, jolting forward to the next crisis, because he's taking us through many different ways of how do we navigate initiatory journeys. And those are the ones that we could choose, like a vision quest, or there's the ones that you might have an accident or a health crisis and you didn't choose them, or an earthquake or a flood, So how do we navigate these initiatory journeys? Jolting forward to the next crisis. The task is to take up a proposition, and he's quoting Jerome Rothenberg here, that postmodern poetics has rediscovered or has retained certain shamanic intentions, reaching back to the animal body rootedness of primitive poetry, recognition of a physical basis for a poem within a person's body, or an act of body and mind together, breath and or spirit, the poet as shaman or primitive shaman as poet and seer. And then he gives us different poets here. He's quoting from Rilke and Lorca and from Rimbaud as well in this chapter, which I won't get into because we don't have time for that braid. But I will say here, the poetic genius, or what we're talking about, we could call them the soul dancer. We could call them the one who paints with glitter across the sky and is a 5-year-old in a class making a painting of something they remember to follow with your imagery, and then they are actually communing with some essence of something they already know or that they're curious about. Herein known as, so he's talking about the faces of Blake's poetic genius, herein in this book, known as the not I, the daimon, the wounded healer, the paraclete, which is another name for the wounded healer. The genius of deformity met suddenly in the precipitous fall of the shaman's death, leaving the herd like a stricken deer. And this is another quote. All fall of the shaman's death, leaving the herd like the... let me start that again. All this seems thrust upon him, a unifying vision that brings with it the power of song and image, seen in his own terms as the power to heal the soul, and all disease viewed as disorder of the soul, as disconnection and rigidity. And so what we're talking about is healing. Yeah, go ahead. I can hear you.
I think it's so interesting what you just said about that very last sentence about being rigidity. When we think about it, it's crazy because the past few months, I have said my body is getting stiffer and stiffer and stiffer by the minute. And if you think about it, as we raise our frequency, it's like pushing us through the black hole to get out of the frequency of the current dimension we are in to rise up into the next. What happens when we die? Our body becomes rigid. We get pushed through that black hole, and we're into the other dimension. We're back as a spirit again. What happens with diseases? Same thing. You get pushed to the max, and then you have to come out the other side. So when you think about it, it's truly, again, with that wetsuit idea, it's truly sucking all of that base junk off of you so that you could still see with new eyes. And I think there was an interesting comment on this one page. It said, of course, the world has changed. And I underlined just those words. The world isn't changing. The world is evolving. And we are being the spinsters of the new world energy. Because just as Daniel is sharing in this book, we are all spinsters of creating a new language, a new dichotomy, a new way of being, and shedding all of that stuff, perhaps.
We're shedding. And how do we not impose anything on others? and instead move into a place of sharing. And I think that one thing that's sort of interesting that is an important theme for Daniel in this book, not only teaching about the wounded healer, the gift that's in the wound, that we all have ways to be healers for each other when we've experienced some terrible tragedy or have gone through something very deep and, heart-tearing. But he's also saying that we all have been wounded as humans because civilization has split the heart away from nature, from the life force, often.
Right.
Or it has given us something like what you've been talking about a lot in this balance between being in the wetsuit and in the wild, sparkling glitter ball. There is the both and of that is wholeness. That a definition of wholeness. And what he says is that our heart has been split when those things are separated out. And we were given a choice of, while we're here in this body, of it needs to be the both and rather than only the this. Only the what you're calling space junk.
Yeah.
But I want to read this one spot if I can, because it's really important distinctions when we talk about new consciousness that he wanted to
hang on one second. Let me just drop this word at the end of what you just said. But also, too, I think, Judith, it's important to understand is that we will still have disease. Our car will still break down. We will still yell at our kids. And we are still good spiritual beings. I think sometimes people forget that, and they think that they are going to go and be wearing white and drifting around in clouds. Well, I can tell you, I live in spirit much more than I live in human, but I can still get up in the morning and feel like my body feels like crap. So I think the idea is that we're not saying that they're right or wrong, that there's you have to attain and that then you'll have success, or that you have to be devoid and then you'll be some, spiritual essence. What we're trying to say is we're sharing our stories of all of our existences. I think perhaps that's really key. We're sharing all of our existences, the new, the old, the antiquated, the enlightened from a long time ago. We're sharing all of our past lives, and all of this is coming up. I think just as for everyone to hear it and say, I have some sense, like you might not even hear the words that we're speaking, but you could feel the energy. And that's what we're trying to do, is raise everyone's vibration to get through that black hole on the other side. Perhaps?
I think yes, and also what do we do about it while we're still here? I think that Daniel's
book
was very much a gift for the right here. So yes, this is not about a one-sided approach at all. And in fact, the dark was much more about what Daniel is championing here than the light. And there's a beautiful poem in there from Robert Bly that talks about how birds that get caught in these grain silos can't get out because they keep going toward the light, but that's not where you can get out. The way to get out is through the ground under the floor. That's the only way out of that particular situation. So how do we have to open up our hearts and our minds, our imaginations, our willingness to experience that the answer to what our problems are may actually be to go down and to have humility, humbleness, the words connected with humus, the earth itself, rather than always be fixating on ascension. The ascension can come later, as you're saying. You're talking about the black hole, but you're talking about what happens after the death of the body. And I have had the incredible experience of being with this beloved teacher and partner, life love of mine, when he left his body. So I have that experience, which I won't talk about here, but I know what it feels like and looks like to see a spirit move outside of a body. And I've worked with people for a very long time who are very much on the edge of passing away or dealing with very liminal health conditions. And so in all of those, there's still the question of, while we're still here, what about that? Like, I think that's what everyone's thirsty to hear.
Right.
It's like, what do we do when we're still here? And so I just want to add a little bit here from Daniel's words himself. He says, in the paradox of the leaping consciousness, so leaping between things, between poems, between wisdoms, between the without and the within, we must learn to be grateful for that which we must ardently oppose. And, it's sort of like perhaps what I'm hearing in part of what you're sharing on a personal level is the tension between being in this body at all, if you already know or have experienced the before or the after. It's like,
right.
Well, how do we deal with the now of this particular thing and not think of it as, not think of those constraints perhaps only as negative, or as he's suggesting here, be grateful for that which we must ardently oppose or chafe up against. At this crossroads, the initiand faces Baba Yaga's question: did you come here by compulsion or by your own free will? If one answers one-sidedly, with what Daniel Deardorff is calling the arrogant New Age, my life is perfect, everything is as I ordained it to be, then one must deny the truth that there are powers beyond human control. And if one answers again one-sidedly, with the victim abdicator's words, my life has been ruined by forces and enemies that leave me no choice and no option, then one denies the equal truth that each of us is responsible for our acts and our lives. The radical task of the other within is to gain that no single position, the impossible locus of Shiva's dance, the thunderbolt destruction and creation of the universe, the poetic task to throw down and restore.
Yeah. I think perhaps many times people will say, the way to navigate today is unknown. And instead of trying to navigate it or find the unknown or be in the unknown, they live in the fear of the door to the unknown.
Mm-hmm.
You see? So if you're consistently living within the balloon and never allow yourself to diffuse through the cracks of the balloon and see that there's so much more potential out there, you'll pretty much be living within and be behind that fear door. And I think this is what the book is really trying to do also, is saying that there's so much more out there. When you even think about the word deformity, we think about physical deformities over the decades. People have been shunned for that for their, eons, right? And then it came to a time when they would take people that had mental health issues and they would put them away too, calling that a mental health and that's a deformity. Oh, don't you see them? They look crazy. Do you know what I mean? That kind of idea. Then we kind of tried to do it with people who spoke out or who raised a hand or people who dressed differently or changed their appearance in either whatever way it might have been. And I think any time you use the word deformity, you're truly saying anything other than that which I choose to accept. Isn't that the definition of deformity for many people?
Yeah, or the definition of otherness, as if we don't all have it, and those others are usually in a negative way, although sometimes also exotified and pedestalized. Those are to be judged by, the person doing the judging who puts themselves in a more untouchable or higher position, as if that's safe. Well, Daniel really calls that out with the first line of the whole book: denial is contagious among humans.
Because it's creating separation. Then you're creating a separation and saying that there's certain ones that can exist and everything else doesn't exist, Or people that go around in denial will say, well, cancer might be out there, but it doesn't exist to me. Okay, sure, okay. Or I live poverty, I live in it all the time. Abundance doesn't show up for me. Well, okay. So in other words, it's creating dichotomies everywhere along your life. instead of seeing that everything exists. Everything exists. Just take it as that.
We also need guides. So Deardorff is a guide through all this material, but what he's giving us is the guidance that is in all the old stories. And his vision was to restore myth to culture and community because he wanted to restore the wisdom of myth and the power of the medicine that's in myth to culture and community. And so over and over again, through all these different doors, all these different strands, these weaves, these portals that are given to us in this collection, which is only 220 pages, but each paragraph you could have a long conversation like we're having about and just chew on it for a while, which is really what he wanted to give us was food, that there's a lot of different keys to unlocking our courage to do exactly what you're talking about, go through the door that we might be afraid of, and find ways to navigate these things where by denying we're creating these dichotomies. Well, what are the alternatives to that? How might we soften the wall in our own heart? How might we do what Trickster teaches us to do, which is punch holes in the wall of rigidity and allow it to become breathable again? And this is what the oral tradition also does. This is what is the medicine of the unspoken as well as the spoken through images that have been carried down for millennia. It's what the mythologist Sean Kane calls porosity, that it breathes like a membrane, that we let things in and we let things out. And this overlapping space is very liminal. From everything you've told me, and we've just met on this conversation for the first time today, you're a person who has been able to, with the gifts that you've been given, with the life that you have had here now in this lifetime, be in liminal time and space. So you have the capacity to do that. You teach people to have that capacity. And one of the distinctions that Daniel makes in this book, which is about the individual journey as we've been talking about it, but it's equally about the social and cultural journey as a collective, and the healing of society as a collective. The overlapping space there can be confused because we're given what Morris Berman calls substitute satisfactions, different kinds of addictions, things that are supposed to feed us as if they're magical, but they're not the real magic because they don't have the risk in the magic. And so Daniel is hoping, I think, that by exposing us, by giving us proximity to these old stories, we will be encouraged, which is a word that means of the heart. It's just like that our heart will have courage, courageousness upwelling within it in the recognition that, this is a different way to be. This is a way that is having wholeness in it. I can feel all these different things and move from what the anthropologist Victor Turner calls the liminoid, the fake liminal, to the actual liminal, like that we can make that leap to the center where we can go, it is the both and. I can develop this capacity within myself to open up. This one passage, if I could, there's a few things that you said where he says, a cheerful mediocrity. I think that's exactly words for what you were just talking about in terms of what happens with denial. So he's here telling a little bit of the story of Maria Morevna, which is a Russian tale. Facing the other within, Deardorff writes, within us, facing the other within us, presents a terrifying difficulty. The trouble is vividly portrayed in a crucial moment of the tale Maria Morevna, handing us the keys to the palace. She, the great warrior queen declares, I must go to battle. In my absence, you shall have the run of things, anything you desire. All is open to you save one small room in the deepest dungeon. That door you must, on no account, seek to prise open. So, then Deardorff writes, if we obey her, the status quo remains undisturbed. Nothing happens, and we live a cheerful mediocrity. I'm not going in that door, so I'll settle for a cheerful mediocrity,
Right,
Yet,
right.
in quiet moments, we may feel a distressing call to that dark room, hidden in the dungeons of the psyche. The doors are locked, bolted, chained, and the long rusted shut. Tacitly forbidden, they are kept out of mind. Thus, the people at the center of things, and here he's saying at the center of society, are buoyantly ignorant, the majority of people choosing to be living in that denial or that so-called safe but more narrow place, while those at the edge are burdened with a bewildering gravity. And you and me and anybody listening who knows that we're edge people, that we listen, that we hear, that we can't help but feel empathically what is all going on, we know that we're carrying a lot of that emotion and that consciousness, awareness that other people are not holding. We're holding double or more than double for them, which gives us great capacity as healers, but it also is an uneven situation. So I think this book is meant not only for the healers to gain courage and tools, but for those who are not yet touched by the stories to get access to something that might crack them open so they start to explore their own wholeness.
Because if you look at it, a lot of the times as healers, I know myself, over eons of existence, soul existence, there's been many implications in some really grave, not some good lifetimes, and some really good ones, and some very enlightened ones. So I think the idea is that when we're in this time, this current lifetime, it's a great challenge to say, what's playing out here? It takes a little while to hone into that. What's playing out here? What position am I playing in this play? And how can I see it unfolding forward? Because if you truly look at it that way, then each one of our lifetimes is merely a play, that we're all playing a position in which we are all serving the good, supporting others, caring for self, and evolving the world forward. We're all part of that. Isn't that the grand story?
Yes, I hope so. I hope we all decide to participate willingly for the greater good rather than for only some people's good. I think that's the question of our times in large part.
But even so, I think sometimes when we see people who are causing dissension or causing trouble, people will say, oh, but that they're not helping the greater good. And I'll say they absolutely are, because what they're doing is they're creating turmoil. They're going around and turning over the rocks and picking up the boulders and saying, there's something under here, there's something under here. Come see it, come find it. And when it evolves and has light, then it turns into be, then we see there's the allness of the universe instead of just self in the universe,
Yes, what you're saying, as in terms of echoing back to what Daniel's teaching in the book is that punching the holes in the walls of the rigidity. It's just like anybody who transgresses, anybody who is the troublemaker, anyone who takes on the trickster role is stirring things up so that they can have at least the potential for transformation, right?
Right.
He writes, the prohibitive cost of denying otherness could not be more crucial to the survival of the human race. Our mass refusal to face the other within has engendered a regimen of socio-political atrocities, genocidal horrors, and environmental devastations, a virulent storm of global proportions. Contrary to the tenets of foreign policy and social activism, a remedy for this aggressive pandemic cannot be mediated, legislated, or enforced at a global, regional, or municipal level. It can only begin at the root, within each individual intrapersonally, and within our nearest and most intimate relations interpersonally. It is therefore in this small and most private of territories that the potential for a truly humane society begins.
I think we have been on the precipice point, as my body has felt and been stiff, and as the world as we see it outside as seeming to be in a state of chaos, I really think we're at that point of that black hole where we will start to pop through, and all of this, whatever, will no longer be our reality. And when we do that, I think there's many millions and millions and millions of people who have had enough of knowing already, just as Daniel has shared in the book. We've all had enough knowing that we're not going to be a fear of it. It's going to be fine. It's going to be exciting. It's going to be, finally get that thing off of my back kind of idea. And I think when that comes, and it is coming, it will be, it'll just be a different evolution, and it'll be so, I think it'll be, as many have said, we've all waited for this time, so I guess maybe perhaps it is the time. Do you think perhaps?
I don't know if I'm going to still be alive when everything changes to the degree that you're talking about right now. So I'm very interested in the incredible transformation that I feel like we have an opportunity to evolve into and transform with each other, with every single conversation, with every interaction with somebody in the grocery store or at the toll booth or, whatever. And, we've there's this sense about the implicate order, as the physicist David Bohm talks about it, that really influenced Daniel's thinking about implicate identity and who we really are inside. And I think what you're teaching a lot and what you're speaking to today in this conversation with me is, can we speak soul to soul when we're having conversations? Yes. Can we cultivate the deeper knowing and wisdom, but also the curiosity, because we're not supposed to know everything. I mean, that thing that you started out with in the very beginning of our conversation about perfection, aiming for perfection, and then we hit a certain age where we're like, well, forget about that, because I know time and I want to actually move to acceptance instead of perfection. What if we all did that? What if we all just closed our eyes right now, and when we opened them, we had more self-acceptance? And then what would happen? Because if we're looking at self-acceptance, then I think we're looking at self-acceptance of all the parts of ourselves, which is why the other within is a portal into that. And then that allows us, if we have that kind of acceptance, that'll allow us to have self-acceptance for each other in new ways, and come up with new ways of being, new solutions, things that can be solved incredibly quickly. I mean, we saw how quickly science was able to rally, and how quickly different social systems and technologies and relationships had to pivot during this last few years in the pandemic. Like, that to me has been a new window into an opportunity globally that everyone got shook up at once. So like, now what? Yeah. And we're still being shaken by it. And so we're being shaken in many, many ways. And what can stabilize us, I think, is this combination of the knowing and the not knowing, the ancient and the current, and to hold both. To bring all of our soul stories all into existence, all into forefront. People are so afraid of their dreams and of their knowing and what comes out of their mouth. They'll say, talk with no filters. It's A-okay, because something's going to come out that's going to be a gem, So, well, Judith, it was such a pleasure to have you with us here today to share about Daniel's book. Could you share with the listeners how to find out more information about the work of the project and the book? Absolutely. So the book, which is on the publisher Inner Traditions, and it's available at your favorite booksellers and through their innertraditions.com website. And the book, again, the title is The Other Within, The Genius of Deformity in Myth, Culture, and Psyche. We have a whole page about the book. It includes the endorsements. It includes some of the songs that Daniel wrote about the book topics while he was writing the book. He was also always a musician, so he was composing music, and that will be included. Some of it will be included in the audiobook, which will come out next year. So if you go to mythsingerlegacy.org, that's MYTHS like summer, INGER, legacy.org, And then there's an events page there. There's a book page there. There's a lot of different ways you can access all of Daniel's teachings and writings and so on that are not published in this book, but also a lot of the musical writings through that website. And I also want to offer my own take on Daniel's work and our life together in case that is of interest to people, and where I'm moving ahead with this synthesis of so much of what I got from living with and working with, collaborating with, and now carrying forward the stewardship of Daniel's work with my own multimodal or multimedia work. You can see my master's dissertation from last year at mandorlarising.net, MANDORLA rising.net. And there's ways to get in touch with us through that. And the Mythsinger Legacy Project would be happy to hear from anyone and keep the conversation going.
Well, Judith, I thank you so much for joining us today, because as we share and we inspire and we do bring forth these words, it's truly important, just as we said, to pick up on the energy and take it and make it your own story. And that's what we've done today. So I thank you so much.
Thanks so much for having me on, Dr. Jeanette. It's been a pleasure.
If you'd like more information about the book we talked about today, Daniel Deardorff's The Other Within, The Genius of Deformity in Myth, Culture, and Psyche, please do click on the link on the bottom of today's show page to go directly to the website to find out more information about the book. If you'd like information about Judith-Kate Friedman and the Mythsinger Legacy Project, and also Judith's work, please do click on the link on the bottom of today's show page directly for her website. And it is about being able to say, yes, so much is going on. Today, we've just spun a lot of words around. We have a lot of thoughts, a lot of stories, a lot of evolving ideas. And it's truly not about taking out your little notepad and your pen and writing it all down, make sure you get all the words so that you could follow it down the road. It's about just taking it in, breathing it in, letting it breathe out, and saying, oh, that just felt good. And just feel good in the higher vibration of the frequency in which we spoke today. That's how we are evolving. That is how we are learning to dance in the new lifetime, and that is where we are going, connecting to soul and spirit. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher, and until tomorrow, have a wonderful day.
Today we discussed many life-changing concepts. Who do you turn to, and how do you know what is best when faced with a health crisis? Dr. Jeanette is a patient advocate. She listens to the patient, the doctors, and the family, clarifies the health issues and concerns, then helps the patient make the best choices going forward. If you would like help implementing change into your life and health, we can talk and see where you are stuck and how to improve the quality of your life. Check the link on the bottom of today's show page or visit dr.jeanette-gallagher.com to schedule a phone appointment today.